Prior to your time at Microsoft, you spent 8 years at Google and were the lead engineer on Kubernetes and co-founder of Kubernetes. Really?
Yep.
Freaking awesome, man. How did the formation of Kubernetes come about? Hey everyone, welcome to Dev Interrupted. I'm your host, Dan Lyons, and today I'm joined by Brendan Burns, Microsoft Corporate Vice President and co-founder of Kubernetes. Brendan, thanks so much for joining us.
Absolutely, great to be here.
Pumped to have you here. I've heard you say that your first coding was in BASIC on a Commodore 64. What was your pathway to becoming a developer? How did that happen?
Yeah, the Commodore 64, I don't think was the first computer that I used, but it's definitely the first computer I programmed. I think I'd used a friend's Apple II. I didn't own, my family didn't have computers at that point.
You had to go to the lab, your friend's house.
Yeah, I had to go to a friend's house, and like one friend had the Nintendo and one friend had the Apple II. So this is like 1983. But the Commodore was actually a bake sale computer. So my third grade had a bake sale. And like what they did at the end of the bake sale was they used the money and they bought a Commodore and they put it in the back of the class. But back in those days, both the Apple II and the Commodore, they just booted into BASIC. Like you could just like at the command line, just type in instructions and go at it that way and poke and or what the commands were for lighting up pixels. Poke was one of them. They just pushed a value into memory and it lit up a pixel. I didn't know anybody. I think the funny thing to think about it is I didn't know anybody who was a software developer. My dad was a lawyer and like people were teachers and worked at Boeing. And I don't think I knew a single software engineer until I got to high school.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question. Did you have a group of buddies that were coding together? How did you take a leap there? No mentors or anything like that?
I had a babysitter who was into computers and she had some books, but she was like early childhood ed person who did daycare and then like was a nanny in the summer. It was like our nanny in the summer and friends of my parents, actually. That's how she ended up being our nanny. But she just happened to be into like an incredible collection of sci-fi novels. And I think by virtue of that knew about computers and had some stuff on that. I mean, it's kind of, it's a very different time.
You know? Yeah. Best nanny ever.
And I mean, when I got into middle school, there was a computer lab. And I hung out in the computer lab a lot, mostly to play video games. Again, Dark Castle, which is still like the world's greatest video game. There was a Mac lab. They was all old Macs. But then we learned how to there was this program on Mac called ResEdit, which is like this resource editor, which let you go in and change all the strings in the programs and change images and icons and stuff like that. And so we started like hacking around that way. And we weren't really coding, but we were hacking around. And then there was a little crew of us, little like middle school dorks. And I did try and learn how to program back then. I wasn't super successful at it.
Yeah.
Partially I think because it was all from books and like the internet really wasn't a thing and you couldn't like just grab tutorials. And like I had to ask my parents, like Christmas one year, my only present, a C+ compiler. Because it was like $400, a lot of money. And I had to be like, get this one, and this is the one I want, and this sort of stuff, right? And so, not super successful. And then in high school, I moved away from it a little bit because it turns out I'm a pretty good distance runner. And
really?
I started running, like cross country wasn't a thing. And
you were doing like track and stuff?
I did cross country and track.
Yeah.
And so I spent most of my spare time like running and stuff like that, and homework in high school ramps up a little bit too. So
no programming, just running, some homework.
Not a lot of programming. I mean, we still use computers. I mean, I still email and stuff like that. Like my mom worked at the University of Washington, and she had email, and I had email at my high school. So we used that as a way of communicating and stuff like that, but not much. And then I got when I went into college, I got the course catalog. I got a book, which shows you how old I am. Like the course catalog came as a book. No digital, no online course catalog. And I flipped through it, and like it turned out that the things that I was most interested in were art and computer science, and that sort of was what I did in college. And so I left there. And then by that point, like it's 1998, and like suddenly across my 4 years at being, like when I started freshman year, and someone's like, hey, there's this Mosaic web browsery thing, and here's HTML, to like the software industry exploding in 1998. So it was an interesting time to be learning and to be on the front of that wave.
Yeah, that's a super interesting times. Thank you for telling us your origin story. I always like starting there. I'm going to move us, on to where you're at now and some of the things about your current engineering organization. Most of our audience is engineering leaders or people who are trying to advance their career one way or another. So I'd love to hear about how you're managing and leading your current organization. I've seen you say, yeah, I guess your teams are doing a bunch of different things: containers, Linux, microservices. You're a hybrid team. You're doing, it seems like you're doing a bunch of stuff. What is your team doing? How big is your organization? How are you structured?
Sure. Yeah. My org's about 650 people these days. Two pizza team.
Yeah, two pizza team.
Keep them hungry. Keep them hungry.
You're following the rules. If they can have...
They said you should only feed your team with 2 pizzas.
Yeah, that's why you're following. Right? Yeah. No team should be bigger than...
Yeah. I heard you're supposed to, like, it's lean. It's all about lean engineering. No. And roughly speaking, that's 4 or 5-ish broad themes. Like, okay. Container, open source, cloud native, containers, Linux. I own most of the like API gateways, APIs to Azure, DevOps to Azure stuff, Terraform for Azure, client AZ, like the client tools for Azure, the web portal for Azure. So a lot about managing your cloud stuff, not actually doing any of it, just the management. And then I actually also own SAP, like the big, like your HR database, whatever.
I've heard of it. Yeah.
Yeah. It's pretty diverse. And actually someone said to me the other day, like, what's the theme for your org? And I was like, well, I can find themes that run across them. And most of the SAP is on Linux, and there's a lot of DevOps, but I'm not sure there's one thing that like unifies it all. And I have pretty strong senior leads, people who have 100, 150 people in their org, and they report to me, and they more or less, I hope that they more or less just do what they need to do. And someone once said to me that I micromanage as punishment. And so like I try, and I think it's pretty accurate, right? I'm pretty hands off, and I try and be pretty hands off, but like whenever I see problems, I tend to get a little bit more in people's, that's how they know that they're in trouble. Because you're diving in, I'm like, okay, now we need to go.
Yeah, I was going to see.
But I think that's been interesting. So across the 5 years I've been at Microsoft, I started with about 30 people, and really only one team, 30 people.
Wow. So you scaled huge. That's awesome.
There's been some scaling.
Was it 30 people working on one of those
basically,
segments?
Yeah,
hey, you get another one. You're here. Good job. You get like...
I started with one team, 30 people. And then relatively quickly, I got an incubations team that had been incubating some container stuff that was really small. It was like 3 people. Okay. And so we grew the heck out of that, partially through acquisition. So we bought a company called Deus, hired a bunch of people, grew that thing a whole bunch. And then through both just organic growth and reorgs for a variety of different reasons, right? Like sometimes because a leader was transitioning to a different thing and they needed to find a home for something that they had previously been responsible for. Sometimes because it just made sense to group these 2 things together. Sometimes because priorities had shifted, and sometimes just because my manager knew that I wouldn't say no. Because I don't really ever say no. That's added.
Is that a thing of yours?
I think so. I don't know, it's a psychological problem that I have or something. I don't know. Like if somebody comes to you and says, we really need you to do something, I'm like, absolutely.
There's a movie on it. Yes, man.
Yeah.
Say yes. Get more opportunities.
I say no a lot to like ideas. And I'll say, I don't think that's a good idea.
Okay.
But if somebody comes to me and says, hey, we have this product area that we need somebody to own.
It's like if it's an opportunity to...
If it's an opportunity to take on more responsibility, more scope, I tend to pretty much say yeah.
For our audience, like that's a lot of successful engineering leaders. I see that trait. When an opportunity arises, hey, we're having some trouble here, or we need someone to do this, or we have a new, I don't know, customer base that wants something. If you say yes, it opens up opportunities for your career.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, that's something that's been universally true throughout, is that, oh yeah, I've never really done that before, but I can learn about it. I'm sure there's something interesting over there. And it's turned out to be true pretty much all the time.
Yeah. What time period are we talking about from the 30 to the 650 in terms of your org size?
I guess I'd say I've roughly doubled every year. COVID kind of slowed it down a little bit, but even there, I think I put on about 100 across COVID. So
what does that feel like?
Hey, well, I don't do most of the work is the thing.
Okay, tell us about that.
Like my teams are out hiring.
Yeah.
So at some level, what I do is like bulk resource aggregation.
So you're not micromanaging the hiring?
Not micromanaging the hiring, but I am definitely like involved in the trying to get more resources. Can we get 30 more headcount for that team? What are we going to do for it? And working with the leads to say, okay, where are the gaps? What are we not able to do right now? What could we do if we had more resources? I think there's different interesting inflection points along that scale line. I think that there's the two most interesting inflection points that I really, one was after a certain point, and I'd say it's roughly 100 people, somewhere in that range, there's always someone unhappy. Probability just says.
Yeah, I mean, we're humans. Humans
exactly,
get unhappy.
There's humans, right? And so it took some getting used to for me to be like, oh, okay, you're the person who's unhappy this week, right?
Yeah,
because every Monday would start with someone who was unhappy about something, and it just took some getting used to not be like, oh my God, I'm the most terrible leader ever. My org is so unhappy.
Oh, I see. Yeah, managing people is different than being an individual contributor, and people have all different types of problems and emotions, feelings.
Yeah.
And it seems like something you had to get used to a little bit, like, oh, this is going to happen often now.
And I think as a manager, you're used to it, but I think as like at a certain scale and also a certain level of indirection, because like I may never have met this person before. Like they could be two levels down and they're suddenly coming to you like, you need to fix my problem. And I'm like, yes, I absolutely need to. And like I had to get over that like urge to immediately jump in and fix it and damper. I think throughout my career, one of the things I've learned as you grow in scale and influence is the need to damper yourself grows too. Like you can really jank your org around if you're not careful, if you don't move slowly. It's like the difference between driving a sports car and like driving a semi-truck.
Did it happen to you? Do you have an experience where you're like, oh, that was a learning moment there?
I've had some. I guess what I would say is, so at one of the reorgs that I got a team that was pretty unhappy to be reorged to me, put it that way.
Okay.
And they were pretty suspicious and I went into that one. It was my normal approach, which is a little bit casual and a little bit joking and stuff like that. And they just completely misinterpreted, like my first sort of group meeting with them, they just completely misinterpreted what I was saying. And they didn't tell me to my face. I only heard about it afterwards. And I realized in that one that I couldn't assume that people would feel the same way. Like I had to come in with a crisp message. I had to come in and be like, okay, this is the message that I need to land. I'm going to land it really crisply. I'm going to be totally on message, on point. I'm not going to joke with people. I'm not going to because they're just not in the place where that works for them right now. And I think I learned that lesson. Like I'd learned that lesson with individual people before. I'd learned that you have to meet the style of the person. As a manager, you can't just be yourself all the time. You have to actually change your style to match the person who you're working with.
Yeah, meet them where they are.
That's meet them where they are. But what I realized is actually it's also true at an org level.
Yeah,
like you kind of have to meet the org where the org is, and that was one where that was a pretty rocky relationship at the beginning with that org, and we got better over time, and then they got reorged away from me to another place. So it was like it was a funny one where I was only a temporary that took care of them for a while.
You got about 650 people. You said maybe 6 or 7 people reporting directly to you, something like that. Like
I think 100. It's like 10. I think it's 10.
Oh, 10.
Total,
okay.
But that includes some IC architect kind of people.
And are these people all over the world, or is it like where is everybody?
Mostly North America, entirely North America.
Okay.
I think it's entirely North America, but not all Redmond. Some California, some Seattle, Austin, North Carolina.
Yep. Spread out within North America.
Yeah, and my teams are actually spread out around the world, but those are teams within these bigger teams that report up to these leads who are with me.
I see. So the leads are all in North America. Teams could be anywhere.
Yeah,
I've
got a team in New Zealand, team in Shanghai, actually a couple teams in Shanghai. We just acquired Kinvolk, which is another startup, mostly in Europe, spread all over Europe, pretty distributed. Little bit of a center in Germany, but pretty spread out across Europe. Yeah. Are
you remote? Or is it just like be remote if you want to be?
Like right now with COVID, everybody's remote more or less. Like a few of the offices are saying, well, if you optionally want to come back, you can come back. Prior to COVID, I would say that we were pretty Redmond centric. My teams are a little bit less, but in general, Microsoft is Redmond centric. I think that along with the rest of the world, we've learned a lot about being remote, and we're going back to a way more hybrid environment than anyone else in the industry from what I've seen, actually. There's obviously startups and stuff like that who are like, we need to get rid of our office and all that stuff. But
sure.
I think Microsoft's been really great at growing and adapting and saying, look, actually, most people want a lot of flexibility, and let's figure out how we can give them that flexibility.
Yeah. Same thing that we're doing at my company, the hybrid, the optionality.
Yeah, and it's tricky. You have to be super mindful about it. Like that's my big challenge right now, I think, is figuring out how we're mindful about it so that we don't end up, because I worry a lot about nobody being able to really get to a place where they're happy because they go back to some default that they're like, oh my gosh, everything's happening at the office, so I'm going to go to the office so that I don't miss anything.
That's also human tendency. It's cool to be remote for a while, then you want to be in the office, and you want to be, actually, I don't want to commute anymore.
I think that what's most important, I think, is that we figure out ways that like people can find the balance that they need.
Yeah.
Right? And I think that's hard. I think, but I know there's just a ton of people who've realized like actually having a little more flexibility makes a huge difference in my work-life balance.
For sure.
And I've had people who are like, you know what, I really want to go fish. But I fish from 5 a.m. to 7 a.m. And so if I can take my RV and park my RV somewhere with decent internet, I can fish from 5 to 8 and I can hop in my RV and I can work with it. And why shouldn't they? And I think that's great. And so I think that people suddenly realize like, oh, actually work doesn't have to look the way that work used to look.
Yeah, definitely. So you got we're remote because, COVID, but you also normally have a distributed team, at least across.
Yeah.
How do you manage all of that? Any learnings or something that you could share about running distributed engineering teams?
I think it's absolutely critical that you have good like leads you trust. That's pretty obvious. But in any situation like that, you really need to have that sense of trust. But I would also say that one of the things I find is that building up your own connective tissue is also really important, right? So I do a ton of skip levels. I do about 100 skip levels every quarter. So out of that 600 people, I do a half-hour one-on-one with about 100 of them.
Yeah. Got to stay connected to the pulse of what's happening there.
Yeah, and because I think that especially in a remote environment where you're not going to run into people at the elevator, you're not going to run into people in the cafe, you have to produce that opportunity for someone to raise a concern to you that they might not either feel comfortable raising to their manager or might even be about their manager. And so I think definitely because there's less serendipity, you have to focus on creating opportunities for conversation.
Yeah, you're intentional about it because it's not going to happen randomly as much anymore.
Yeah.
So you got to go, I think you said the best way, provide that opportunity. If we got down to an individual team of, I don't know, 8 to 12 engineers, is it, with your org, is it work the way you want to work? Or is it like, hey, we're a Scrum organization, or you have to do Kanban, or this is the road you have to follow? How do you balance that kind of stuff?
I think it's a mix, right? Because when you exist in a bigger org, it's important that there is centralized dependency tracking and things like that, right? Because if we're going to depend on something in Azure networking, that's another 1,000 people in a different place. And if we all decide like they're going to use Jira and we're going to use some other ticket, it's just not going to work. And so we have to have the ability. In some places we say, hey, you're going to use Azure DevOps. That's just the ticketing system. I'm sure you can love Jira and I'm sure you can love other stuff, but we're all going to use this thing, right? And I think that's okay because like at some level they're undifferentiated. I'm sure that the Atlassian people will come and be like, no, but it's.
I'm sure that let's bring out the battle card versus Jira. But no, it's like.
Card. But at the end of the day,
I don't know if that's going to change my life as an engineer.
Exactly.
Like I have other stuff to do.
And similarly for things like monitoring and alerting, there's a bunch of these things where it's actually really important to have centralization for the whole org. And what does it mean to be like we have different severity levels for an alert? In fact, actually, interestingly, for a while between some of the bigger orgs at Microsoft, it was a little different. Okay. And people would be like, oh my God, that's a severity 1. And this one's like, oh, that's a severity 0. And it was actually the same. They meant the same thing with different numbers. But having that kind of level of normalization is really important. But at the same time, I think it's important to give teams the flexibility to find the thing that works for them. So I have teams that work in .NET. I have teams that work in Go. I have teams that work in Rust. And they have different procedures associated with them. I do think it's important to have certain things the same. I have expectations around the basic engineering principles of like.
Do you post them? Here's our principles.
I haven't posted them. I've talked about them in all hands, and we do. And to be honest, we should do more, and we're trying to do more around automation. We're saying like everybody needs to report. Like, I don't care how you measure your code coverage, but everybody needs to report their code coverage.
Well, that leads to another good question. Are there a standard set of metrics? So it sounds like code coverage is one of them. Is there any standard set of metrics that get reported to you? Yeah,
there's oh my God, there's so many different things. Too many, honestly. But there's things, and they're all around the gamut. And some of it's things like code coverage. Some of it's things like are all your certificates auto-rotated? Like
security stuff. Yeah,
it's not just security. It's also like best practices too. right? Are you reducing toil? Effectively, are you reducing toil on your engineering? Because it's not just are your certificates rotated. It's like you don't want humans rotating your certificates, right?
Yep.
And then also, of course, there's stuff like how often are your teams getting paged? In fact, we just went through this like DRI health review. How often are they getting paged? How long? How quickly do they respond?
Like MTT, like mean time to restore stuff.
That kind of stuff. But also like how I think there's both like how good are they delivering the service, which is important. But there's also like how disruptive is your service to their lives, which is equally important.
Yeah.
Right? Like how often are they getting woken up in the middle of the night? Which
it matters.
Sleep and all this sort of stuff. So there's a lot of those kinds of metrics that are out there, and then of course business metrics too.
Are you doing anything with DoRA metrics, cycle time, change failure rate, nothing like that?
We do a little bit of, I guess what I would say, what we do we measure differently problems that get to multiple regions versus getting to a single region, which is like how fast is your monitoring good enough that it picks
that's
up
like a spread effect, like a reach effect of the issue.
Yeah.
And when can you catch it?
It's a, how do you have the right monitoring in place to catch something? And I will tell you that it's a much bigger deal if it gets to multiple regions than if it gets caught in a single region. And because from a customer perspective, we make a commitment that like if you're in multiple regions, you should be pretty safe. So if there's a correlated failure in multiple regions, that's far worse than if there's a problem in a single region.
Yeah. What's your philosophy around actual versus planned? Meaning, are you the type of leader where it's like, hey, it's going to take as long as it will take, as long as it's high quality? Or maybe and that's one extreme, like another extreme might be like, hey, you said that you were this team would finish it at this time frame and you're late. So we're like not hitting our metric there.
It's got to be both.
It's always the safest.
Yeah, no, but I'm serious about it too. Like I've done enough engineering to know that I guess what I would say is every time you miss a deadline, in my mind, it is an opportunity for that engineering leader to reassess how they figure out deadlines, right?
Yeah, that's probably a lot of reassessment. We all miss deadlines.
But we should be getting better, and we should be,
more
if you're not getting better,
predictability.
Yeah, even if it just means, hey, look, I know. I mean, like I can tell you for me, my own personal learning was like every time you think of a number, double it. Okay, because that was just my learned probability was like, Brendan, you think that something's going to take half the amount of time that it actually will take every single time. And over time, you just realize you're like, okay, I think it's going to take 3 weeks. Okay, I'll say 6 weeks. And so I think, and I also think like date-driven development is a good thing at times.
Yeah.
Because it clarifies the mind.
Working within a boundary can bring out the best solutions or creativity. I've seen that.
Although I will also say that I'm a really big fan of the release train approach, which is to say the release leaves the station at the same time every single week.
Is that how you're doing it across your?
It's how we try and do it because I don't want, because like I had teams where it was like, oh, let's just hold the release for one more change. Let's hold the release for one more change. It'll come in like an hour. It'll come in an hour and a half. It'll come in tomorrow morning. People would rushing to jam their thing into the release so that they didn't miss the train. And the two things that happen there is you get way worse code review.
So you get worse because they're rushing
to
get
come
it
on,
in.
we want to get it in. Let's get it in.
Yeah.
And so they're going to give a way lighter weight code review because they don't want to give a bunch of heavy comments that somebody's going to have to take a bunch of time to.
Yeah, you got to read it. You got to digest, make the changes. You're going to miss the train. But quality.
And then the other thing is that train has been heavily backloaded with no soak in like dog food, right? So like we continuously deploy our build. We do like generally speaking weekly release, but there's a continuous build that's out running in like a dog food environment.
Yeah. And so you can always get the latest. Yeah.
Yeah, and so if you jam most of the changes into your release in the last day, it's had almost no soak time.
Oh,
right?
yeah.
And so your release is less stable too. And so I really feel like that's one of those things that's pretty important to be like, no, train leaves the station at noon every single damn day or every single week. And if you miss it and you wait a week, and setting that expectation, right?
This is an assumption, but when I think about maybe a team your size, I would think also though, like when you're releasing, do you release to a percentage of the populated environment, like staging the release? Hey, like 1% of the users are going to get this, then 25. Oh, we found an issue. Because it's real world behavior.
Service, because a lot of the services are regional. So it's more like we release to East US, we release to West US.
Similar mindset. Yeah.
But more regional. But some things are global, and the global services tend to release sharded in a different way. So I guess the answer is yes. In general, we do stage releasing. How you determine how you stage depends on the detail of the service.
Super interesting. We could do a whole show just on how you work. Very cool. Interesting stuff. How did you make the journey from thinking like an individual developer to becoming an organizational leader?
Yeah, it's a long journey. So there's that and lots of little stops along the way. And I think it happens very naturally in some sense because like you're working in a code base and you develop something and you become the expert in that area. And then people start asking you questions and you get used to helping them understand. And then somebody comes and says, hey, I really wish that I could have this feature faster. And you say, if you give me another developer, I could probably do it faster. And suddenly you have a small team. And then you realize that actually you want to do something bigger. And there's this really good person on your team. And so you say, hey, you're going to take over this team. And suddenly you've delegated the responsibility to them. And you start taking that first step up the ladder. And then eventually, I think that's one of the jumps. And then the next jump is when somebody comes to you and you have two teams. And it's suddenly, okay, now I have to split my brain in half. And I'm going to have moments when I'm thinking about this team, and I'm going to have moments when I'm thinking about this team. And I would say that phase continues for a while. And then the next phase shift for me, really switching from a team that I had built to a team that I had inherited. And how do you get to know a new team? How do you become a leader of a team that didn't naturally just find you to be the leader? That's that was another kind of organizational challenge. So you have to learn how to establish yourself as a leader as opposed to organically just be the leader. And then I think most recently, the sort of at the 400 or 500, I realized that you have to figure out how to be an at-scale leader, meaning like, how do you maintain, you're so far distant maybe from the experience of someone in one of your teams. How do you know what their experience is like? How do you figure out, I've joked that I want like the button that's like in the airport bathroom, where like you leave and you press the like happy face or the sad face. I would love to have every one of my engineers like punch that button every single day, because you lose data. Like you just don't have the sense of what their lived experience is. And so I started doing a lot more like office hours so that anybody could sign up and come to a one-on-one or like skip level one-on-ones. A lot more broadcast all hands style stuff where I previously assumed people would just get the message about what's important to me, what the message about what might work, what I want work, how I want to think about work-life balance, how I want to think about these sort of like broader topics. And I realized it wasn't happening. And so I needed to do more like conscious broadcast style stuff. And then especially in the pandemic, I've also been trying to figure out like, how do you get that, like people would bump into me in the elevator and just start talking. And sometimes it's really awkward because you're like, I think I should probably know who you are, but I have no idea who you are. But a lot of the time it's somebody, and when we're all on Zoom and everything's a formal meeting, like those interactions have gone away. And so I'm starting to do virtual coffees and some virtual happy hours, that sort of thing, just to give a little bit more of that casual interaction. So that's been the at scale part of it. And then also learning how to damper yourself. That's actually also really a challenge, I think, where early on I had some experiences where I'd run into somebody in the elevator like that. And they'd say, hey, I'm thinking about this idea. And I'd say, oh, that's a great idea. You should really go pursue this. And then 4 months later, they'd ask for a meeting. They'd be like, I've devoted my life to this. And you're like, wait a minute, it was just an elevator idea. Like maybe like we should have checked in a little bit. And so you realize you have to, because you don't have that fast interaction, you have to damper your response, because the power or the impact that you have on that person is much greater than it was when you were the tech lead and you ran into them every day. And so there's this sort of responsibility it's like steering an ocean liner instead of a speed. That was definitely a challenge to learn. I've benefited a lot. I think the places I've been have also really provided a lot of great leadership training, a lot of great mentor, it's not something where it's, oh, I woke up and suddenly I knew how to do this. It's much more like you meet with the other people who are doing it in the organization that you're in, and you all figure out like what's worked for you and what hasn't, and people suggest things. And
it's certainly a journey of evolution and learning. Do you have any kind of internal algorithm that you use to decide, hey, when should I delegate this, or when should I dive in and see what's going on? I'm sure you have to think about that all the time, especially as you have scaled. Is there any kind of like reasoning you use to make that determination?
Yeah, I think you should delegate always effectively, right? Like, first of all, because I think that, at least I don't know if everybody, for me, like my natural reaction probably is not to delegate, because delegating is scary, right? Delegating is giving someone else responsibility for something that at the end of the day is your ass is on the line for. And so it's scary. And so I think we shy away from it. And so I think that trying to bias yourself towards delegation is the right thing to do. And then someone once said to me that I micromanage as a form of punishment or as a form of expressing that I have a lack of confidence. And so when I come in and I tend to dive deeper, it tends to be because for whatever reason, I'm not as confident that you're headed in the direction that I think you need to be headed in. And I'm not certain. And so like the reflection of my uncertainty is less delegation, more reviews, more. And sometimes it's just prioritization too, right? Sometimes I have to be like, hey, look, like this is an important customer over here. And you may think their issue is not super high priority, but the problem is that they bring a ton of revenue and they have a great support contract. So it is actually, we don't get to choose that one. We're going to go talk to this person. Or sometimes it's broader strategic, like you just don't have the context. Let me come help explain the context. And once we get, it's like a little bit of I view myself like an editor. Right? It's my job is to say, oh, you know what? That chapter's a little confusing. Let's go rewrite that chapter. Or maybe you just need to bring this context in about what to help explain. But I think that some of the best advice I ever got from someone in one of these leadership training things is that you should always be leaving. You should always be like everything that you are doing, you should be figuring out how you can stop doing it. Who's going to be the person who's going to pick it up? Who's going to be the person who's going to take it on, and that's the thing that's guided me throughout is like everything I do. It helps I'm a little lazy probably. It's like everything that I'm doing, I'm trying to figure out how can I stop doing it. Yeah.
I love the mindset, totally the right mindset, because it can help. It's how you scale yourself and how you can grow your career so you can move on to the next opportunity. If you're going to build up and be stuck with the projects that you have, you're never going to move forward. So I love the always be leaving mindset.
Yeah.
So prior to your time at Microsoft, you spent 8 years at Google and were the lead engineer on Kubernetes and co-founder of Kubernetes, really.
Yep.
Freaking awesome, man. How did the formation of Kubernetes come about?
Yeah, it's an interesting story. So I was in web search for 4 years. So I worked on Google Web Search, special focus on low latency indexing, news and blogs and social media and like anything where you needed to get it from published into the index really, really quick. And not just like wait and crawl once a day or crawl every 12 hours or whatever. But like, you post something on Twitter, you expect it to be searchable immediately. It's sub-second.
Yeah, that's crazy.
It's interesting. It's a fun problem. It was a really fun problem. But there was a big reorg and it left Seattle where I was. I worked at Google Seattle. I mean, I grew up in Seattle. So I switched, and at the time we looked, and cloud was really, had a lot of white space. And so it was really attractive. As an engineer, I find myself gravitating towards places where there's lots of opportunity.
Sure. Yeah, makes sense.
Conversation. And so it had a ton of white space. And so we gravitated into cloud as a team. I was leading a small team. I was leading a team of about 7 engineers at the time. And we came over, and through doing cloud, I came to have a sense for the way that people are building things out in the real world, as opposed to the Google world. Horrible, to be honest, right?
So you would hear like from a friend or something, like, here, hey, how did you construct or deploy or release or this project? And what you heard back was, whoa, that's like behind the times or something? Or how did that?
Look at it. Well, I mean, there's people were using Chef and Puppet. And
I remember.
A bunch of SSH and some bash scripts. And it wasn't so much that it was like they were suffering, like broken glass suffering. It was that it just didn't seem to work very well. Like 85% of the time it would work, and like scripts would fail, and it was heavy and slow and all this kind of stuff. And at the same time, Joe, Beta, and Craig and I were all working together, and Joe and Craig had created the Compute Engine, which is the virtual machine product for Google Cloud.
Yeah, I remember Compute Engine, and then so they were looking for something, you're saying?
You get to a point and like you've built it and you've shown it, and then the other people are going to take it over, and they were looking and they were thinking about what comes next. And I've been working a lot in the config management space, like CloudFormation-ish stuff or Terraform-ish stuff, and actually looking at Chef and Puppet and Salt and all this tech a lot too at the same time. And we all collectively found Docker right in the early days of when Docker happened. And we looked at Docker and it was like, wow, this is such a necessary prerequisite, because in order to get people started, they have to be motivated to build container images and run containers. And so here's this amazing startup that has come along and built a case for why you should care. In all of our plans, step one was convince people to care about containers. And all of a sudden it was done, right?
Yeah, it happened, you're saying.
It happened.
They cared.
And so we were like, oh my gosh, okay, this is an amazing opportunity. But I don't think they'd had a ton of experience at scale. and they hadn't had a bunch of experience in what happens with lots of machines instead of just one machine. Docker was focused on one machine and a container and a daemon on one machine. And so we said, that's great. And that's fantastic, but you need orchestration. And that started off the process of selling executives on this idea that we should build out this container orchestrator and that it represented an opportunity to change the market, change the landscape in cloud.
What does that look like? Is it really, is it like a VC pitch session? Hey, yeah. You have 5 minutes to catch my ear. Yeah.
I built up a demo of what it could look like and pre-hacked together and captured some interest and then convinced people that this was possible and a good idea, but then we had to argue for it being open source instead of being a product.
Yeah.
And so we had to argue a lot about it being open source.
Is it the arguments because of money?
Yeah, I think money and control. Everybody would rather own everything, right? Like
I don't know. Well, it depends on what you're...
It's one of those things where from a business perspective, you can make it something that is the only thing, it's like massively successful and you're the only one who can sell it. That's great. But the problem is you can't, right? Like in order for it to be massively successful, you need an ecosystem. And in order for there to be an ecosystem, you need it to be open source. And so, but it took a while to convince people that was true. Because it takes a while for people to let go of the dream. I had someone at one point in a different context say like, I'd love it if we could create Terraform but it only worked with our cloud. And I was like, yeah, that'd be great. But the reason people are interested in Terraform is because it works with multiple clouds.
Yeah, that's the
it's not an option.
You convinced them that it was going to be open source.
We got a bunch of other people to join in with us. And then early on, Red Hat came over and joined us and started doing a bunch of co-engineering work. And they contributed a bunch of really senior people and did some really great work. And we did a ton of like legwork, and people like Kelsey came along and started doing a ton of evangelism and driving attention and interest. And it was a hard couple of years, I think, of pounding the pavement, convincing people to care and stuff like that. Like, I think looking back, people are like, oh my God, it just is the thing that took over. But I think people don't realize that in those first 2014 to 2016, it was a lot of work, both in the building and also in the evangelizing.
What did you learn in like the first experience? So I don't know, I think you might have said 2 years, or like the first, before it really took off, like some learnings there, and then scaling in open source. And what did you learn about the next phase of like scale of an open source community?
Yeah, I think the thing in the first part was really a lot about getting people in the door and being inclusive. Like,
okay,
I say the best analogy I can say is like the first like 10 minutes of a campfire, where it's every twig you add is very carefully placed, and you're trying to make sure that you're not like every little flame is like one of your children that you need to protect. And so every single person who came and filed an issue, filed a PR, came to our Slack, whatever, like we wanted to really make sure that we were helping them, bringing them in, because every single one of those people was like an important part of a community, right? Like when you're into the tens of thousands, I think it's still really great to build an inclusive community, but if one person bounces off, it may not matter quite as much. But in the early days, really making sure you have a warm welcome was hugely important. And because I mean, it's viral, right, at some level, and like both the positive and the negative are viral, right? Like if people say you're a bunch of jerks, like it's really hard to unwind that.
Yeah, that will spread. And if it's great to be in this community, that will spread.
Exactly. And they become cyclical. I think the governance thing was really interesting because we really got to it, and we got really lucky. I think that we didn't have a bigger problem before we had governance and code of conduct and things like that in place.
Oh, I see. You kind of got onto all of that once it was already pretty.
Yeah, I think we came to this moment when we really realized we needed governance. I did this survey of the community, and it was like the first community survey that we did. And the results were basically, we love this thing. We think there's a lot of potential. We're really excited about it. We have absolutely no idea how the decisions are made. We have absolutely no idea how we can join in and help. And that was like the wake-up call for me to say, okay, like we actually need to formalize all this stuff.
Right.
Because with 100 people-ish, it hadn't really been necessary. Because everybody was like at least 1 degree of separation away from somebody who knew how to do something. So like you want to get code merged in a certain area, it was relatively easy for you to go to your lead and say, hey, who do I need to talk to? And then go talk to that person. But when you're into the thousands, suddenly people are like, I have no idea why this PR is getting merged and that PR is not getting merged.
Yeah,
I have no idea why are we working on this thing instead of working on this thing. There was no sense for that, right?
Yeah. Which is disorienting for someone working.
Yeah, and actually ultimately starts to work against you because people are like, oh, there must be some plot. This is all like there's a conspiracy here to advantage this person in this group or advantage this person in this group. Or people just bounce off because they're like, frustrated. They pour their hearts and soul and energy into a change or into something, an issue or whatever, and they just hear crickets.
Right.
And they walk away. And so I think it became really clear that we had to get a lot of formality in there, both because like it's important from an organizational structure perspective, because like just because you haven't written down the rules doesn't mean there aren't rules. It just means that most people don't know them. And then also just from a scale perspective, we needed to ensure consistency in all the places where we were. And we were getting some fiefdoms and stuff like that, which is ultimately pretty destructive. So we got it done. And I think it's an interesting lesson in like when you need it as a leader to back away from the way that you naturally work. So like a great example of this is the KEPs, the Kubernetes enhancement proposals. Like when they first were presented, I was like, this is the stupidest idea ever. This is some random bureaucratic, why do I have to file this proposal and a KEP number and follow this stupid process? And I was just 100% wrong. And it's because I was in the like early days mentality. I was in the hack it together. You meet with 3 people, you just move.
Sure. Yeah, that's a good, that feels good too.
And you have the ear of the community. It feels great. But what I realized was actually that this process, it was hugely democratizing because suddenly everybody was standing on the same ground with the same process and the same way of getting heard. It didn't matter who you were or who you knew. Like everybody had to go through this process. And so it's way more inclusive and democratizing. And then also it leaves a record because if you've been around from the beginning, you know why all the decisions were made. But if you're joining into a project 3 years in, because it's suddenly hockey sticking and suddenly everybody's talking about Kubernetes, you have no idea, like, why is this built the way that it is? Why was this decision made the way that it was? And so the KEPs also became a historical record of why decisions were made the way that they were, which was also hugely valuable. And so I think it's a great example of a place where like it's not by nature something that I would do. And so I'm really glad that we didn't build a benevolent dictator for lifestyle approach. Because it was someone else who was better at that phase, who's better at the like, how do we organize this thing? Somebody who could get excited about building a process, who came in and said, here's the process, and I'm going to define it for you, create it for you, and this will be how we go forward. So it's a good example of why the building that community and getting all those people together is really important.
That's awesome. Amazing story. So, of course, we know Kubernetes is open source, and I saw you've been involved in open source projects since around 1999. What's your perspective on the value of open source?
I think there's I have a bunch of different perspectives. One perspective as like a member of these communities, for me, it was just an awesome way to get my feet wet in software development. And I think it still is. I still have interns and others come to me and say, like, how do I get a sense for what real software development is? Because I think it's hard to get that sense in college. Like you're in a class, you work on a project by yourself. There's not like 8 years of legacy code that's poorly documented that you have to integrate with or whatever. And I'm like, it's hard to just like get somebody to take you on and but it's easy to get in open source. People are always looking for something, somebody to come in, and you'll get that sense because open source isn't that different. It's got the same legacy, it's got the same lousy documentation, and it's got all that. And so I think it's a really great way to learn. But I think it's also, for me, like it was like the unreconstructed hippie parents. I was the child of the unreconstructed hippie parents who met in the Peace Corps. And so in a sense, like the classic, let's all get together and build stuff is definitely in my DNA. I think more recently, what we've also realized is that there's just a ton of hard work out there, and a lot of it's pretty undifferentiated. And so if you have to just like rebuild it every single time, it's going to take a long time to build the stuff that you actually care about. And so it also is a way for the whole world to come together and say, like, that problem, that's not a problem we really care about making money on. So let's all work on a really good solution to that problem. One of them, not 10 of them, but one of them. And then we'll worry about how we make money on top. And I think that's really an amazing thing as well, that open source is powered. So I think those are all really great things.
Yeah, really well said. Are you still contributing to a bunch of projects today in current times, or are you having to slow down?
I'd say definitely slowed down, although I'm the primary contributor to the Kubernetes clients for Java, C#, .NET, and TypeScript. And then I help with the broader for infrastructure for for client generation and sort of the client side of Kubernetes in general, the non-Go client side, which has been fun. It's good actually because it's one of those projects where it's interesting and there's a lot of users. So you have an NPM library with like 100,000 weekly downloads, but it's not so intense that if I need to check out for a week to go handle some internal escalation or something, that I can't, like, I'm letting people down. So it's got a nice balance of feeling like people are using it, but not feeling like you're so critical that you can't go do other stuff. And of course, I use a lot of stuff too. I do try and give back when I use something. If I find a bug or the documentation's wrong, I do try and toss a PR to them. GitHub has made it so easy to like just fire a PR to somebody that you try and like make it a little better, you know?
Yeah, it totally makes sense. I think it's nice that you can choose your own contribution level and where you can fit in your own time commitment. If you want to be full go and be really relied upon, you can work your way to that type of role. If you want to be in an area that's maybe changing a little bit less, or you don't want to be someone that's mission critical, you can contribute in that way as well. You obviously have a ton of experience building, maintaining, you're growing communities. We'd love to get your perspective. We actually have about 1,500 engineering leaders in our community that we've actually built around this podcast. How do you keep communities thriving after you get them going a bit?
Part of it that I think is really important is making them feel like it's their own. I don't think you can sustain, unless you're like some really amazing broadcast celebrity or something, like you can't sustain a community just on your own outbound broadcast. Like you have to make the community feel like it's helping build it and it's responsible for it and it's involved in it, that it has a piece of it, really. I think that's one of the, in my mind, that's one of the most important hallmarks of a successful community, is that it really is like it's a graph. It's not a unidirectional broadcast. And I think that's part of it. I think that people look for freshness. I mean, I think you know this, but you go to a GitHub project and one of the first things I do in the new GitHub project that I found is like scan, like what's the most recent commit. It's like most recent commit 2 years ago. All right, we're moving on. Yeah, I'm sure it's tough, right? Like you got to keep generating new content and new stuff like that. But I think that people are looking for the freshness. I don't know. I think those two things go a really long way. Figuring out ways to. Yeah, I think Kubernetes did a really good job early on figuring out ways to like decentralize and empower different groups. And then also allow the organic to be the organic. But like we never had a concerted effort to create meetups. But like meetups just sprung up. And it's not like we could have been kind of like what Docker did. And we're going to have Docker captains and we're going to really try and control the message. And we never did any of that kind of stuff. And I think we just let some of that stuff happen outside of our control. And I think that was also good because it made people, I don't know, just sort of help people feel like they could own something.
Yeah, absolutely. Totally makes sense. Okay, so Brendan, shifting back to Microsoft here, after your time at Google, obviously you kickstarted, you co-founded, you made Kubernetes, joined Microsoft, you've had some great success there. What's Microsoft's strategy going forward for helping customers adopt containers or Kubernetes? What's the next thing going on there?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the biggest thing that we never did that I always wanted to do from the beginning, which was part of it, was like phase 2 of the plan, was making life easier for developers. I feel like we've done this amazing job of making life easier for operators and people who are on call, and maybe it's the same person. DevOps means maybe it's the developer person and the developer and operator are the same person. But we've only helped the operator side of their persona. There's so much work that needs to be done in terms of making it easier to build and scale distributed systems. And I think one of the things that I've really loved about coming to Microsoft is I don't think there's a company in the world that has its history in terms of developer productivity. And I don't think there's a company in the world that has its current impact in terms of having resources like GitHub, having resources like Visual Studio Code, having a viable, strong, and growing public cloud. No one has that combination. And so we have an ability to reframe, if Kubernetes reframed the cloud APIs, I think we have an opportunity to reframe cloud development. It's super hard, right? I came here 5 years ago thinking, oh my gosh, we're going to do it in a week or whatever. And it's taken a lot of time, but I'm excited. I think we're starting to see the pieces come together and we're starting to see people get interested in it and getting the tools people interested, getting the languages people interested, getting everybody interested in it. And I'm pretty optimistic. That's certainly the mission for the next 5 years. We'll see. But it's hard.
Yeah, very hard. That's amazing. So I've heard you say that one of your goals is to improve developer experience for distributed systems. Can you unpack this for us and share how you're going about that task?
Yeah, it's hard. I don't know, going about it is maybe like it implies at some level that we're succeeding, but we're trying, I guess. We're trying. And I think part of it is that I don't think that there's any great libraries for the patterns of distributed systems. So one way to think about it is there's a big difference between reading like a sorting algorithm and being able to call just like one is I see this on paper and I have to figure out how to translate it into code and not make mistakes and et cetera. And one is just like I made this call and the thing came back sorted. And I think we need to do more of that in distributed systems where it's okay, locks, distributed locks. I get it, but I don't want to implement it. I just want you to implement it. And so I think we have this project called Dapper, the Distributed Application Programming Runtime. It's at dapper.io and up on GitHub. And it's trying to do some of that stuff, like trying to say, like, okay, can we actually build a standard library, but for distributed systems patterns so that you don't have to re-implement the wheel every single time? Because I still think there's a lot of that re-implementing of the wheel. And then there's also, when you think about the actual development, there's things like if I'm developing a microservice that's part of a bunch of microservices, I do my development locally, or maybe I do it in some cloud instance, but either way, like I'm not developing literally in the place where all these other services do. And there's always been this sort of tension of, do I try and pull like all of the little microservices and run them all in one environment? Do I try and connect, but I don't want to connect to production. And there's this, project called Bridge to Kubernetes that the developer folks within Microsoft have been building that integrates with Visual Studio Code and otherwise to try and help you through that process of, I have my little microservice, but how does it work with all the other microservices that are being built in a development environment? And then I think the other thing that we've been looking at is some of the runtimes we've been looking at, like WebAssembly and how that might work in some of these systems to give people a really fast, like inner loop dev experience where they can get that sort of TypeScript. I made a change and I suddenly see it changing, but in a distributed environment where it's actually going into a container, that sort of stuff. So that's some of the stuff that we're working on, but I think it has to be, and you spoke about open source communities earlier, I think it has to be done in an open community. I don't think Microsoft or Azure can come out and just be like, here you go. I think it's going to have to be a dialogue. We're still printf debugging, right? That's a big thing in my mind. Everybody's still debugging with log statements and printing, and that's kind of crazy. So there's a lot of different pieces that we can improve on.
Yeah, so many different facets to touch here. It seems like you're working on solving some important pain points. Is there any other initiative that you and your teams are working on that we should all know about?
What else? I mentioned the WebAssembly work, which I think is really interesting and exciting. I think one of the other areas, it's a group effort, but the work on policy for Kubernetes, I think is pretty important. I think anybody out there who's working on Kubernetes who hasn't thought about policy and how you can use policy to ensure, and it gets back actually to the developer experience, because I'm a big believer that we shouldn't be trying to get developers to memorize more and more stuff. We should give them guardrails. And so policy for Kubernetes is a way to establish the guardrails for your cluster to say, hey, look, you can't pull images from anywhere except for our private register. You can't put things on the public internet unless you've gone through a security review. There's ways that you can shape the objects that people are creating in that cluster in a way so that like you get the right best practices, but you haven't forced this developer to memorize this giant checklist. It's just literally they can't deploy the thing that doesn't fit in it's almost like a compiler. It's like checking it's like linter, or maybe linter is a better term. It's like a linter that's like checking your code for problems.
Kind of want to make sure that you're, as a developer, I think what you're saying is like free their mind so they don't have the cognitive load on things that aren't that are important, but let's get the guardrails there so you can actually work on the creative stuff and worry about things that matter from like an innovate or like a creativity standpoint.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it's important to note that it's not like we're trying to say, oh, we want our developers not to understand it or not be capable of doing it. Or I think there's plenty of stuff like you can program in assembly language, but like mostly you don't want to, right? You're just way more productive if you program in a programming language. And similarly, like you can understand how to do things in Kubernetes securely, but it's just way easier to have all these pre-checks where you're like, oh, it didn't work. Why didn't it work? Oh, because I'm trying to put something on the public internet. I shouldn't be, right? That cognitive load is really the thing. You're taking it away and enabling that brain space to focus on all the stuff that I can't handle for you, your business logic or whatever that I can't do for you.
Totally makes sense and very useful for the community. This has been a fantastic conversation. Brendan, thank you so much for taking time with us here on Dev Interrupted and talking about your career journey and all the amazing work that you've done with Kubernetes, as well as what's coming next at Microsoft. What's the best way for our guests to follow your work or learn more about what's going on with you?
Sure, Twitter, Brendan D. Burns. There's a D because Brendan Burns was already taken. So Brendan D. Burns. But yeah, that's probably the easiest way to reach me.
Okay, great. Definitely check out Brendan on Twitter. Make sure you have the D in there. And a quick reminder for our listeners, if you haven't already reviewed the show on Apple Podcasts, please take 60 seconds to do so. Reviews are super crucial for the way that our show gets discovered. Also, be sure to join the Dev Interrupted Discord community where we keep this type of conversation going all week long. You can find all of the information in the links below. And Brendan, thank you so much.
Absolutely.